Spring 1944. The Wehrmacht Intelligence Bureau, tucked within the stone fortress of Army Group B headquarters near Paris, compiled its assessment with clinical precision. The American forces massing across the Channel were not soldiers, they were civilians in uniform. Factory workers. Farm boys. Shop clerks with rifles. The intelligence officers had seen enough to know that these men, trained for barely 6 months in hastily assembled camps, would shatter the moment they faced German veterans hardened by 5 years of industrial warfare. The prediction was unanimous and delivered with a confidence that bordered on contempt. The first invasion attempt would fail. Those who did land would panic. Those who didn't panic would die. The best American efforts would achieve perhaps a temporary foothold before German counterattacks shoved them back into the sea, just as the channels themselves seemed to demand. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reviewed the reports and nodded. He had seen men like this before in North Africa, soldiers who fought as if war were some organized sport, driven by logistical abundance rather than ideological conviction. They relied on artillery. They relied on air support. They relied on replacement troops shipped from factories across an ocean. They did not have the warrior spirit. They did not have the hardened core that separated true soldiers from conscripted civilians. But this assessment contained a fatal flaw. It was not false, it was incomplete. The German officers were right that American soldiers were less individually seasoned than their Wehrmacht counterparts. They were right that American training, measured in months rather than years, seemed inadequate when compared to German preparation. They were right that American tactics relied heavily on material superiority. What they failed to account for was that in modern industrial warfare, the systematic production of adequacy defeats the proud cultivation of excellence. The German army prided itself on creating elite warriors through intensive training and rigorous selection. America prided itself on something far more dangerous, creating reliable soldiers at unprecedented industrial scale. January 1940. Officers at the War Department in Washington had recognized what lay ahead with terrible clarity. A great army would be needed. Not an elite force. Not a volunteer corps of professionals. An army. 12 million men would be drawn from cities and farms and pulled into a machinery that was itself unprecedented in its ambition. 240 military training camps would simultaneously process millions of recruits through standardized curricula. Every soldier would fire the same rifle, the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic marvel that gave American infantry a weapon no other nation's frontline troops possessed. Every soldier would carry the same pack, eat the same rations, receive the same inoculations against the diseases that had killed millions in the previous conflict. Every soldier would be photographed, numbered, catalogued, and assigned to a unit where his individual qualities mattered far less than his function within the larger organism. This was not military science as the Prussian Academy taught it. This was manufacturing. This was American production applied to the creation of soldiers. The German officer corps found this approach contemptible. Leadership, they believed, required individual character. Initiative. The ability to see the battlefield and act decisively without waiting for orders from above. The Wehrmacht's NCO Corps was legendary precisely because these men, sergeants and corporals and junior lieutenants, possessed the knowledge and judgment to command. An American soldier, by contrast, seemed almost programmed. He followed instructions. He waited for orders. He depended on his officers for guidance rather than acting with inspired initiative. A Wehrmacht infantryman could navigate complex tactical situations through instinct and training. An American infantryman seemed like an automaton, effective only when plugged into a larger system of support, supply, and command. This distinction mattered enormously to the German mind. It confirmed their sense of cultural and martial superiority. They were warriors. Americans were, at best, organized technicians. June 6, 1944. 0630 hours. The prediction would be tested on a beach called Omaha, and the German officers had chosen this moment well. The defenses had been positioned to maximize casualties. The beach itself had been left relatively open, forcing the Americans to dash across hundreds of yards of exposed sand under direct fire. The ocean was cold. The current was strong. The landing craft were slow, vulnerable platforms that had to lower their ramps in water often chest-high, forcing the men to wade forward into a cone of machine gun and rifle fire. The German defensive calculation was straightforward: the first Americans across would suffer 70 to 90% casualties. The survivors would be so traumatized that further waves would panic. The beachhead would collapse. The invasion would fail. Democracy would not be exporting itself to Europe because democracy's sons did not have the courage to die for it. What happened instead was not dramatic in the way the Germans imagined. There was no brilliant counterattack. There was no crushing Wehrmacht triumph. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: the Americans kept advancing. They died by hundreds. They froze in the sand. They huddled in groups trying to claw shelter from a beach that offered none. And then, somehow, through sheer accumulated effort and the steady application of firepower and the seemingly endless supply of replacement soldiers, they moved forward. By midnight on June 6, the soft recruits had established a permanent bridgehead. By week's end, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers had poured across the Channel. By month's end, Germany's best remaining divisions were being ground to powder in the bocage of Normandy, fighting an enemy that accepted 20 to 30% casualties and simply kept pushing forward because there was always another American soldier waiting to take the place of the one who had fallen. The German assessment began to shift, though not toward grudging admiration. Instead, it shifted toward something darker: the realization that they had misunderstood the nature of the conflict entirely. A Wehrmacht colonel captured in July 1944 told his American interrogators that the American soldier was tactically inferior. The American soldier avoided close combat when possible. The American soldier depended on his officers for orders rather than acting independently. The American soldier was, in every fundamental way, less of a warrior than his German counterpart. And yet, the colonel added with a certain bewildered frustration, the Americans seemed to have an infinite ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting. This was not military excellence. This was systematic pressure. This was an army that did not need to be good, it only needed to be inexorable. The symbolic representation of this power was often the most mundane object imaginable: a cigarette. Every K-ration issued to American soldiers contained cigarettes, usually 4 in a pack, placed among the canned meat and chocolate bars and dextrose tablets and chewing gum. An American soldier in 1944 was, on average, eating better than the vast majority of German soldiers, who had been on strict rationing since 1938. More troubling to German officers was what this abundance signified. It suggested that the war was being fought not by a nation sacrificing everything for survival, but by a nation fighting almost as an afterthought to its normal economic operations. America was producing cigarettes. America was producing chocolate. America was producing canned fruit. America was producing uniforms and ammunition and vehicles and spare parts in such quantities that when a soldier fell behind German lines as a prisoner, he often ate his first truly satisfying meal in years in an American POW camp. 3 billion chocolate bars had been manufactured during the war years, distributed to American soldiers around the world. The average German could not imagine such waste. That it was waste the Germans could not prevent only emphasized their powerlessness. By early 1945, the German High Command had revised its tactical assessment. It was not that American soldiers were becoming warriors. It was that American soldiers did not need to become warriors. They needed only to remain functioning members of a machine that was itself vastly superior to anything Germany could construct. The German army had always believed that war was won or lost at the moment of combat, in the clash of wills between trained soldiers who could navigate chaos through experience and instinct. But the American approach was different. American war was won before the moment of combat, in the careful calculation of supply lines and replacement rates and ammunition production. An American division would enter combat at full strength. If it suffered 20% casualties, American logistical systems would ensure that it quickly received replacement soldiers to bring it back to near full strength. A German division would enter combat at whatever strength it had managed to gather. Once soldiers were lost, Germany had no way to replace them. Once ammunition was expended, Germany struggled to manufacture more. The American approach was, from a Prussian perspective, almost ugly in its pragmatism. But it worked. By March 1945, the German High Command faced the final proof of this assessment. The Rhine River stood as Germany's last meaningful defensive barrier, the psychological and strategic line that separated the heart of the fatherland from enemy invasion. If Germany could hold the Rhine, perhaps the collapse could be delayed. Perhaps the Americans might tire. Perhaps some possibility of negotiated settlement might yet emerge. It was fantasy, but it was the only fantasy remaining. The German officers positioned along the Rhine knew what was coming. They had received intelligence reports about the massive accumulation of American forces opposite the river. They knew that Montgomery's meticulous planning would produce a crossing attempt of unprecedented scale. They had positioned their artillery. They had mined the approaches. They had stationed their remaining units, Volksturm, the old and sick, Hitler Jugend, the indoctrinated youth, and Fallschirmjäger, the parachute troops who, despite their depleted numbers, still represented the most combat-hardened formations Germany could field. March 23, 1945. 1,700 hours. The German artillery observers along the Rhine watched as the first smoke screens began to materialize behind the American lines. The smoke had a peculiar quality. It wasn't natural mist but rather artificial concealment, created by smoke generators and masking what lay beneath. The German officers knew what it meant. The crossing was about to begin. They had prepared for this moment. They had calculated their firepower. They had positioned their machine guns for maximum coverage. They were ready. March 23, 1945. 1,900 hours. The largest artillery preparation in the entire war began along the Rhine. 4,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. Not German guns, American guns. All 4,000 of them. The barrage continued for 4 hours. The earth itself seemed to convulse. German artillery positions were obliterated. German defensive positions crumbled. German soldiers cowering in trenches and pillboxes found themselves experiencing something none of their combat experience had prepared them for, an artillery preparation so massive that it transcended the usual categories of warfare and became something closer to natural disaster. German officers later recalled that even veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the Soviet barrage before Operation Barbarossa in 1941, stated they had never experienced anything equivalent to the Rhine bombardment. 900 hours, March 24, 1945. The bombardment ended. For a few minutes, the German defenders braced themselves for the infantry assault. Instead, they heard a new sound: hundreds of aircraft engines. Operation Varsity, the massive airborne assault, was unfolding directly overhead. 14,000 paratroopers and glider troops descended across the eastern bank of the Rhine. They came floating down in parachutes and landed in gliders and rappelled down ropes into a landscape that was still smoking from the artillery preparation. German defensive positions that had survived the bombardment now faced assault from above and from the river simultaneously. The 6th British Airborne Division lost 1,400 men out of 7,220 who landed. The 17th American Airborne Division lost more than 1,000. But they established themselves. They spread inland. They captured German artillery batteries that had been designated to punish the infantry crossing below. And below, American infantry in amphibious assault boats began crossing the river. The boat captains had been expecting heavy casualties. The German defenders had been expecting to inflict them. Instead, the crossing succeeded with remarkably few losses. 41 American soldiers were killed in the first assault crossing, a casualty rate so low that American division commanders initially questioned whether their intelligence reports were accurate. The German 180th Infantry Division, which had been positioned to defend the crossing sector, began to collapse almost immediately. Not from courage or cowardice, but from simple overwhelm. Their defensive positions had been destroyed. Their artillery support had been neutralized. Their communication lines had been cut by airborne troops descending directly into their rear areas. The division's commander, Brigadier General Klosterkemper, found himself in command of a formation that had ceased to function as a coherent military unit within hours. By March 25, 1945, the American 9th Army under Lieutenant General William H. Simpson had a bridgehead across the Rhine that was 10 kilometers deep and 12 kilometers wide. The German defenders had been captured or killed or dispersed. The 180th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The The German 116th Panzer Division, arriving as supposed reinforcement, found itself surrounded within days. The entire front had collapsed not because individual American soldiers had suddenly become brave or skillful, but because the American system had proven, once again, to be overwhelming in its material superiority and its ruthless efficiency. A German captain, captured during the Rhine crossing, told his American interrogator something that would echo through the post-war historical record: the American soldier was not impressive as an individual combatant. He did not display the tactical initiative or the personal courage of the best Wehrmacht soldiers. He followed orders. He depended on his officers. He seemed almost mechanical in his execution of assigned tasks. And because of these very qualities, because he was part of a perfectly functioning machine rather than an autonomous operator, he was nearly impossible to defeat. The captain had expected to face warriors. Instead, he had faced a system. He had expected to match wills with individual opponents and prevail through superior training and initiative. Instead, he had encountered something that had no will to match and could not be defeated through any individual act of valor. In the weeks following the Rhine crossing, American forces captured more than 360,000 German soldiers. The German army continued fighting because Hitler had ordered it to continue fighting. But the officer corps now understood, with terrible clarity, what had transpired. The common assessment, that American soldiers were soft, undertrained, inferior in every martial quality, had been correct in almost every technical detail. But that very technical correctness had blinded them to a larger truth. The American soldier was not fighting as an individual warrior. He was fighting as a component of a larger organism. His weakness was his humility. His inadequacy as an individual fighter was compensated for by his function within an enormous, precisely calibrated, industrial system of warfare. German commanders had spent the war trying to defeat American soldiers as warriors. They had failed to recognize that American strength did not derive from the warrior spirit. It derived from something far more prosaic and infinitely more powerful: the systematic application of material resources without limit, the replacement of casualties at a rate that finally broke the psychology of even the most experienced defenders, the absolute conviction that quantity of supply could eventually overcome any quality of fighting spirit. The chocolate bars that remained in German officers' hands after capture became almost symbolic of this defeat. The American soldier carried more food than he could eat. He carried cigarettes he could trade. He carried medical supplies and rations sufficient not just for himself but for captured Germans. Meanwhile, the German soldier was hungry. The German soldier was exhausted. The German soldier was part of an army that could not replace its losses, could not produce ammunition at the rate it was being consumed, could not feed its wounded adequately. The German officer saw these differences clearly. What he could not quite articulate was that the war had fundamentally changed somewhere between 1940 and 1945. In 1940, when Germany was faced with France, individual excellence and decisive maneuver had been enough. A mechanized force guided by brilliant officers could sweep across the continent. But by 1945, when Germany faced America in an industrial war of attrition, individual excellence counted for almost nothing. The German soldier could be twice as skilled as the American soldier, and it would not matter. The German army could not be twice as skilled as the American war machine. And a machine does not surrender its superiority through acts of martial virtue. It surrenders its superiority only when it fails, and the American war machine had not failed. It had not even really struggled. It had simply continued doing what it had been designed to do, converting raw industrial capacity into military force, replacing casualties, advancing, grinding, winning through sheer, inexorable, aesthetically ugly superiority. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 represented the final vindication of a war philosophy that would seem almost heretical to any officer trained in the European military tradition. Warfare, according to the American system that triumphed at the Rhine, was not primarily about the clash of warrior wills or the brilliant inspiration of individual commanders. It was about supply lines and replacement rates and ammunition production and the capacity to take casualties and keep moving forward anyway. The German soldier at the Rhine was often superior as a fighter. The American soldier often won despite being inferior in tactical skill. This was not a paradox. This was the fundamental reality of industrial war, and it had been proven conclusively on the night of March 23, 1945, when 4,000 guns opened fire and changed the nature of conflict forever. The age of the warrior was over. The age of the machine had arrived. And when a nation aligned itself completely with the machine, when it subordinated individual excellence to systematic efficiency, when it accepted the replacement of warriors with components, when it converted its entire civilian industrial base to the production of war, that nation would inevitably prevail. The German High Command had failed to understand this until it was too late to change course. By then, the American soldiers crossing the Rhine were not trying to prove themselves warriors. They were simply executing their function within a system that would not stop until all resistance had been ground into dust beneath its mechanical precision.